Percy and the Santa Engine, written and told by Kiefer Adams. Percy loved Christmas time. He was always jolly and very festive as he delivered the mail across the island of Sodor. Some of the other engines thought Christmas was just an excuse for extra work, but Percy enjoyed every second of it. One evening, Percy was resting in the shed. He was feeling very pleased. "Salty told me a great story," he said to no one in particular. "What sort of story?" grumbled James. "Well, he told me about the Santa engine," said Percy. "Pooh!" huffed James. "Who's the Santa engine?" "Well, he comes around on Christmas Eve and thanks all the engines for being really useful," explained Percy. "Stuff and nonsense!" snorted James. "There's no such thing as the Santa engine. He's just a silly little story that's been made up to keep the Christmas spirit going." Before Percy could say another word, James had huffed away to collect his coal trucks. Now, Percy didn't feel very festive anymore. The very next morning, Thomas was at the big station with Annie and Clarabel. He had been worried about Percy throughout the night and had thought of everything he could do to perk him up again. Edward had noticed. "Don't worry about Percy, Thomas," he said. "He'll be all right." "Yes," said Thomas doubtfully, but he was very hurt by what James said. "Well, perhaps the Santa engine could cheer him up," suggested Edward. Thomas wasn't sure how exactly he could lift Percy's Christmas spirit, but as soon as the guard blew his whistle, he was out and away on the open line. He was determined to cheer Percy up one way or another. As more hard work carried on across the Fat Controller's railway, Percy felt more and more miserable. James's words had been racing around his rods for the entire day, and it had almost affected it. Trucks were misbehaving, and passengers were complaining about Percy's roughness with the coaches, especially when it came down to Gordon's Express. When his work was over, Percy parked himself in a small siding. He looked up at the sky. "I wish I could prove to James that the Santa engine is real," he thought to himself. By the time Thomas had finished with his passenger run, dark clouds had started to gather. The snow had fallen heavily across his branch line, and Thomas was still wondering what he could do to lift Percy's spirits. As he pulled into the last station, Thomas had started to notice that most of the stations on his branch line had been heavily decorated for the Christmas holidays. Even Annie and Clarabel were impressed. Thomas had also noticed at the top station that there was a Father Christmas walking about, giving good joy to all the children. Then, Thomas suddenly smiled. "That's it!" he cried. He remembered what Edward had said. "Percy will get his Santa engine," he puffed, "and I know just how to do it." He quickly darted out of the next station, Annie and Clarabel shrieking all the while behind him. It was very late when Percy returned to Titmouth Sheds. He was tired, but still feeling rather down. He backed into his berth and was just about to go to sleep when, "Ho, ho, ho!" a loud booming voice echoed across the shed. Percy looked around. Next to him, Gordon, Edward and James were fast asleep. He then looked to the other side of the shed, where he saw Henry. And then... Percy wasn't quite sure what he saw, but it looked like a little engine with a cute little Santa's hat, a large white beard, and a wreath wrapped around his tanks. "Hello, Percy!" the engine boomed. Percy blinked. "Mr. Santa engine?" he asked. "Yes, indeed," the Santa engine boomed. "I've come to thank you, Percy, for your hard work and being really useful for the Fat Controller's Railway. Ho, ho, ho!" Percy was pleased. "Keep up the good work now," the Santa engine said. And before Percy could say anything else, there was a great cloud of steam, and it seemed that the Santa engine had gone. "Keep it down over there," shouted Gordon from across the shed. Percy was too tired to reply. He was soon fast asleep. Christmas morning soon dawned on the island of Sodor. Thomas was the first to awake. The other engines were still asleep. He looked over and saw Percy. He was snoozing happily, and there was a small smile across his face. Thomas almost giggled when he saw the Santa hat on Percy's funnel. He smiled warmly and was pleased of the good deed he had done. "Merry Christmas, Percy," he whispered. Thomas then went back to sleep. But he did wonder, should Percy wake up, would he notice the small piece of cotton wrapped around Thomas's buffer beam?